The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Yesterday at Law Amendments, we heard from people across Nova Scotia raising warnings about the ill-conceived and potentially disastrous rollout of legalized cannabis. We heard growing concerns about the province's plan to allow the consumption of cannabis in public spaces. John Travs, the Director of Legal, Insurance and Risk Management for the Halifax Regional Municipality, has suggested that cannabis consumption ought to be treated like alcohol, where open consumption is in outdoor public spaces is prohibited. Instead, this government has said, as long as you're not on a sports field, light it up. Will the Premier explain why his government has decided to allow such liberal consumption of cannabis?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Indeed, what the Minister has been working and consulting with Nova Scotians across the issue of implementing a product that's being legalized by the national government. Our role is to actually ensure that it's available in our province. We're doing it in what we believe is the safest possible way to ensure that it's safe for Nova Scotia families. If she looks at the additions that we made around the Smoke-Free Places Act, it's not as simple as she would like to make it out to be, that you are able to smoke anywhere in this province. There are restrictions around where you consume this product, and we fully expect, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians to follow the law.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
This just highlights the province's growing confusion over whether they want to treat cannabis like tobacco or treat it like alcohol. There's lots of confusion, Mr. Speaker. You have to purchase it like alcohol, but you consume it like tobacco. Like tobacco, it can't be advertised, but like alcohol, you can produce it in your own home. It ignores advice not to co-locate and allows Nova Scotians to drink in a bar, step out, smoke a joint, and then walk right back into the bar. On golf courses even, you can drink a beer, smoke a joint, and drive a golf cart? Will the Premier explain why his cannabis policy stands to confuse everyone while actually protecting no one?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The fact of the matter is, this piece of legislation has been brought by Bad Canada says it is the most progressive legislation in the country, Mr. Speaker. They stood with us, Mr. Speaker, to tell us that we are protecting Nova Scotians when it comes to the issue of this product. This product will be made legal, will be made available to Canadians and to Nova Scotians. We're ensuring, Mr. Speaker, that this product is made available in the most safe possible way in this province, and we're continuing to look forward to working with our partners to ensure that that is the case.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on her final supplementary.
Yesterday at Law Amendments, a government member defended public consumption by stating that low-income Nova Scotians who will not be allowed to smoke in their apartments will need to go to the park. I guess low-income Nova Scotians don't need better wages. I guess low-income Nova Scotians don't need reliable public transportation or a doctor. I guess low-income Nova Scotians don't need better jobs. Low-income Nova Scotians don't need 5 days of pay when they are assaulted in their own home. Low-income Nova Scotians just need a better place to get high, Mr. Speaker. So my question is to the Premier, is this really the best defence the government can offer for its poorly planned cannabis consumption?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate has actually gone down in this province, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member that young Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
In this province, Mr. Speaker, we bucked the trend, Mr. Speaker, when it came to out-migration. We have now an in-migration of young people in our province, Mr. Speaker, because the very thing the honourable member is referring to, Mr. Speaker, they see a good-paying job on the horizon in Nova Scotia, and they're lining up to take them, Mr. Speaker. At the continuing, Mr. Speaker, we've seen 100 physicians coming into our province, Mr. Speaker, and we're very happy to work with Doctors Nova Scotia to continue to provide opportunities, Mr. Speaker. And the fact of the matter is, unlike the honourable member, Mad Canada has stood with us and said this government is actually getting it right when it comes to the legalization of marijuana. And Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, I'm going to stand with Mad Canada.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last week we learned that BP is spending around $250,000 a day transporting its drill rig to Nova Scotia, despite not yet having final drilling approval from the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board. We also learned that officials of the Regulatory Board have been canvassing South Shore municipal councils in support of BP's application, prompting the Honourable Wilfred Moore to describe the board as a petroleum industry cheerleader. I'll table a copy of his remarks. Mr. Speaker, since the Gulf Coast disaster, many people don't trust BP. With the Petroleum Board acting more like a promoter/lobbyist than a regulator, how can the Premier expect people to trust them either?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things in the east coast of Canada, the Nova Scotia Petroleum Offshore Board, Mr. Speaker, has been one that has been recognized at the national level and international level, Mr. Speaker, in ensuring that they protect the environment. The reality of it is there has to be a balance, Mr. Speaker. We're going to ensure that if there is activity off our coast, creating good economic jobs, driving the economy of our province, it will be done in a way to protect the environment, Mr. Speaker. We believe both of those can happen, but the fact of the matter is the Nova Scotia Petroleum Board has a responsibility to ensure the activity off our coast is done in an environmental safe way, and we will hold them to it.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of our province have parallel concerns about the quality of regulation in the forest industry. When veteran forester Danny George first blew the whistle on old-growth forests being improperly clear-cut recently in Guysborough County, the Minister of Natural Resources assured us that there's a system to prevent this. DNR has since admitted that Mr. George may in fact be right, which raises the question of why and how the department did not, and apparently does not, know what's being cut on its own Crown land. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier grasp that the public of the province has serious misgivings about the competence of the regulatory work being conducted in the Department of Natural Resources?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly heard from Nova Scotians of concerns about the activity in the forest sector in our province. I've also heard from others, Mr. Speaker, who believe that we can continue to do further cutting, Mr. Speaker. With those two opposing views, Mr. Speaker, I've gone out, got a very independent voice outside of our government. Dr. Leahy, who was providing a report about the future of how we not only ensure that the forest environment is there for all of us to enjoy, but at the same time we do it in have a forest industry in a sustainable way, and I look forward to that report coming back.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this diminishing public confidence extends to environmental regulation as a whole. In 2008, this House settled the tire burning question unanimously, passing a bill against it. When in power and approached by Lafarge, the present government backtracked on that position. When community members went to court to say the Minister of Environment should consider the evidence of third-party expert before approving tire burning, the Minister took the position that this was not required. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier understand that from citizen court challenges to the CNSOPB, DNR and the Department of Environment, his government needs to do a much better job of upholding public confidence on environmental questions?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as the Department of Environment has continued to work as a regulator in our province, continue to ensure that we strike the right balance, that the interests of Nova Scotians are heard. When it comes, how do we continue to do activity which provides economic growth and opportunity at the same time sustaining our province and keeping it there for future generations? We, as the regulator, they strike that balance. One of the challenges for the Department of Environment, no matter what decision they make, Mr. Speaker, there will be those of dissenting voices. The beauty in this province, there are other mechanisms if they don't agree with the decision of the environment to go down and appeal those decisions.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. During his appearance before the Standing Committee on Law Amendments, Mr. Traves estimated that legalized cannabis will cost HRM millions of dollars. HRM actually has had no discussion with the province about what, if any, funding will be made available to offset the cost of legalized cannabis. These increased costs will force some municipalities to increase taxes or actually go in the red. Will the Premier say once and for all when his government is going to assist municipalities with the cost of legalized cannabis, and when is he going to let them in on his plan?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there's a consultation going on across the province, including here in HRM. The Honourable Member should know that, Mr. Speaker. The person before law amendment should have referenced that. The reality of it is there are costs associated with the legalization of this product. We know they'll require more equipment that will be required in police officers' vehicles across the the province. There's advertising that we're looking for cooperation from them. We'll continue to build on that. Fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have a difference of opinion when it comes to whether or not this requires more officers. We believe that we'll continue to make our case. We look forward to working with our partners as this product becomes legal.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
In addition, concerns were raised about the government's plans to allow municipalities to add additional restrictions on the public consumption of cannabis. This issue is actually twofold. First, there is the possibility that, as happened with cigarettes, the rules will vary widely from one municipality to the next. The second is that the local bylaws do not carry the same weight as provincial laws and are probably unlikely to be enforced with the same rigor. We've heard repeatedly that this government is working with its partners on this issue, but from what those partners are saying, and as what we heard in law amendments, it doesn't seem that way. So how does the Premier plan to address the issues that were raised yesterday regarding the enforceability of bylaws on cannabis?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member's question. To go back, we've been engaging municipalities across the province, continue to work as this product becomes legalized. There are some that have their own police forces. There's others who use the federal force, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to policing. Continue to work with our partners. We have a very different view when it comes, in some cases, that the cost of the implementation on an ongoing basis. We're prepared, though, to sit down and have that conversation with our municipalities. One of the things, though, we heard loud and clear from municipalities and law enforcement agencies, Mr. Speaker, say wanted the ability inside of certain parts of this province to actually make rules that pertain to them, like we do in Truro when it comes to smoking. There's no smoking in one of the main streets of Truro, quite frankly. That's put in by the municipality, the town of Truro, Mr. Speaker. In this law, we've given that same provision. And then when it comes to the detail of using, when it comes to the purpose of using cannabis.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. This weekend, a radio call-in program asked Nova Scotians to comment on how inclusive education was working for their family. Dr. Strang, our province's Chief Public Health Officer, told the host about his 12-year-old son, who is significantly impacted by autism, is nonverbal, and has an intellectual disability. Dr. Strang said, quote, "There is no place for him in the current school system in Nova Scotia." I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, how is the government's plan going to ensure that children like Dr. Strang's are included in our public education system?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, there are, albeit a small number of these cases. One case like this is far too much in our education system, Mr. Speaker. This is exactly why we struck the Commission on Inclusive Education. This is exactly why we'll be moving forward with their recommendations to improve our system of education, to be more inclusive, and that will entail more behavioral supports, special needs supports, mental health supports, Mr. Speaker. It will mean better training and professional development for our educators, 2/3 of whom have told us they have not been properly trained to deal with the diverse needs in our classroom. And it'll also mean tailoring our education system to meet the needs of each of these children instead of trying to fit them in the boxes of our current education system.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, this is a child who can't be in a classroom. Dr. Strang's experience is that there's no capacity or flexibility in our education system to support families. The Commission on Inclusive Education has recommended increases in funding, specialists, and support over 5 years to build the capacity of the system to fully meet the needs of all students. Unfortunately, the Minister has already announced his intention to cherry-pick from the recommendations and has been silent on the Phase 1 call for an autism strategy, has also indicated that his government will not follow through on the recommendation to establish a Nova Scotia Institute for Inclusive Education, which could independently monitor these recommendations. Mr. Speaker, given the government's lack of commitment to full implementation, what reassurances can the minister provide to families like the Strangs that things are actually going to improve?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, we have indicated that we are pursuing all the objectives of the Commission on Inclusive Education's report, Mr. Speaker, and that means changing our system so that students like the one the member is speaking of actually will have available to them intensive individual supports when that's appropriate, or smaller group learning opportunities, which is important for a number of our students, Mr. Speaker. And it also means that we've budgeted for these supports to be in place for September. We've budgeted $15 million, which is in line with the recommendations of the Commission, to make sure there's more behavioral supports in our system to give these students better options and better supports, Mr. Speaker. I'll note this is a budget that the opposition parties have voted against.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much. My question is to the Minister responsible for the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The government uses an online portal to process the Freedom of Information requests. And if a person or organization wishes to get information, or make an information request, they are forwarded to that FOI website. The government's website has been down for 6 days now for an unscheduled outage. That's 6 days where members of the public have been either unable to request documents or examine those released documents. So my question to the minister, can she please provide an update on why the website's not available and when it's expected to be restored?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for the question. I'd like to clarify one point. The portal has been down. There is an issue with the portal, so our IT staff has taken it offline to fix that. However, requests are still being processed. You're still able to make requests through email or through written submission. The requests already in with the office are being processed, and the office is open and available for any questions that a requester may have about a request they have in the department.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Now, Mr. Speaker, it can be expected that websites will be occasionally down due to maintenance or by a bug, but I tell you, 6 days of downtime seems a little outside the ordinary and greater than one would expect. A cynic would also view the extended outage as an attempt to possibly subvert the FOIPOP process, but I'll take the minister's comments to heart. But I'm inclined to believe that it's just technical difficulties. In either event, a certain level of redundancy would be expected from an open and transparent and accountable government so the citizens are not walled off from important information for a week. What backup systems are in place for the FOIPOP website, and why did it not kick in to restore the website?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our backups are the fact that our FOIPOP office is running and processing requests as we speak. You're able to email your request, you're able to write your requests in, and you're able to call the FOIPOP office to see what the status of your request is or get information on public requests. So it is business as usual within FOIPOP apart from the portal.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer, but quite honestly, most people are forwarded to the website in order to see it, and I'm sure, if they really want the information, they will call the 1-800 number, but a lot of people will look and they go, well, I'll come back tomorrow and maybe the website will be up, and maybe the website will be up. We're gone 6 days now. Journalists, parties, and members of the general public all rely on the site to review government business and activities, and the results of the FOIPOP requests are posted publicly, but the identity of the requester is concealed. So if it's not available on the website, how are the rest of the folks being able to see this? With the silence around the system failure, we don't know the nature or whether this private information has been compromised. So I'll ask the minister, can she confirm to us today that the personal information and payment credentials have not been leaked or compromised in the course of this unscheduled system outage?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
I'd like to assure the member, Mr. Speaker, that safeguarding our privacy, the public's privacy, is of utmost importance. As I believe I mentioned to him last week during question period, we recently developed a comprehensive breach protocol that's already in place within government, and it will be rolling out this spring. But in terms of our FOIPOP, I'm also happy that he appreciates the openness and the transparency of our procedures. But the FOIPOP office is still up and running. Phone calls can be made. There are people there who will answer, and your requests are still being processed.
Good job.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
But I know the minister is kind of missing that we've we've asked people to go to the website to get their information. The website's not there. People make their decisions accordingly. The system has not met, I believe, the basic standard of transparency around the outage. They could have told us a few days ago that, by the way, it's down. Here's how you deal with it. And with the massive breach around Facebook, the cavalier handling of personal data is much on the minds of Nova Scotians and Canadians and people around the world. The minister should provide a full accounting of the impact that it should have on users. Will the minister table all correspondence? Well, I do a FOIPOP, but I really can't at this point. Will the minister table all correspondence between her department and IT services so that we know that a breach has or has not occurred?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Well, I'd like to remind the member that he is able to put in a FOIPOP request either through email or through in-written submission. And as information becomes available, I'd be more than happy to follow through on that with the member.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, we're very concerned about the lack of access to mental health services and addiction services across this province. In particular, in January, the Nova Scotia Health Authority made a decision to close the addictions office in Bedford Road, located downtown Halifax. This closure has reduced access to services for those needing help with their addictions. This office has been in downtown Halifax for 25 years, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, why was this addictions office moved and relocated out of downtown Halifax?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, as a government, with our partners like the Nova Scotia Health Authority and other community-based partners, we are investing and supporting both mental health and addiction services. In fact, to refer the member to the work that was ongoing with our investments in opioid treatments, Mr. Speaker, methadone treatments, our naloxone kits in partnership with Pharmacy Association of Nova Scotia, to help individuals to avoid the negative impacts of a drug overdose on opioids, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're very concerned that decisions are not always made in the best interests of patients and those needing access to services. For example, Mr. Speaker, a decision was made to stop funding a therapist providing a program called Affected Others. And this program helped the therapist work with those affected by alcoholism and drug abuse, specifically the spouses and children. The money has been taken away for that program, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister of Health a question. Will the Minister commit to restoring the funding for the program called Affected Others and also the addiction services in downtown Halifax?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important to note that the services that were offered at the site located in downtown Halifax that the member referenced are still being offered within the Halifax area, Mr. Speaker. So those work and those services are still being offered by the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the employees that were working there. It's really just a matter of a change in location in that regard. With respect to other specific programs and services being offered, Mr. Speaker, we have a wide variety of programs and services being provided for people with mental health and addiction services. I'd advise the member of one in particular program that's, again, rolled out in communities across the province in partnership with the Pharmacy Association of Nova Scotia and other healthcare providers. That's the Bloom program, Mr. Speaker. We have a wide variety of programs and services to help people with mental health and addiction needs.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Residents of the town of Shelburne are worried that the Roseway Hospital is going to be shut down. Recently, evening lab services were eliminated, and at 11 p.m., the doors to the hospital locked from the outside. According to the NSHA website, the Roseway is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mr. Speaker, does the minister consider a hospital to be open if no tests can be performed and the doors are locked?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Work that is ongoing in the area around Shelburne. We're pleased that there's the work ongoing with the collaborative practice being built up. Expecting the doors to open there, Mr. Speaker, in the fall of this year, I believe. Mr. Speaker, providing the services and the supports, expanded family physician recruitment, Mr. Speaker, providing care. And Mr. Speaker, I toured that facility, and in addition to the lab services being provided there is work also, I believe, in other means of providing lab test results with healthcare providers through point-of-care systems and so on in our hospitals across the province, Mr. Speaker. So the ability to perform tests is still available in many hospitals throughout the province, in addition to direct lab services.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, we've seen cutbacks to local hospital services, and I can tell you that it doesn't end well. Like the people of New Waterford, the people of Shelburne built their hospital from the ground up through fundraising and donations. They ought to have a say in what kind of care is provided. However, with this new one-size-fits-all model, there's no guarantee that the health care they will need will be available, and residents are worried that losing control means losing their hospital. Mr. Speaker, can the minister assure the people of Shelburne that their hospital is not under threat?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I assure all Nova Scotians that it is of the utmost importance and priority for the government as well as our partners in Nova Scotia Health Authority, the IWK, frontline physicians and other healthcare providers to ensure all Nova Scotians get the healthcare services that they need in their communities.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Environment. Last October, I asked the Minister of Environment if he had a plan, he had a plan for Carter's Beach preservation before the start of the upcoming summer season. At that time, he committed to installing permanent outhouse systems if that's what the liaison committee wanted, but said it would be the municipality's responsibility to operate those systems. The minister said there was a meeting scheduled for November and suggested that he might have more to say after that meeting had occurred. Will the minister please update the House today on what plans are going ahead to preserve Carter's Beach this summer?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Meetings are ongoing with the Community Liaison Committee for Carter's Beach. We have already installed new interpretive signage to encourage responsible use of Carter's Beach and locating the eco-sensitive areas of the area. We'll continue to have those meetings and we'll support the community as they go forward and make sure there's a balanced approach to ensure that the recreational opportunities exist for the beach and that there's good soil protection in the area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the minister for his response. Carter's Beach has once again been listed as one of the top 10 beaches to visit in Nova Scotia. The beauty of this beach is undeniable, but it is at risk if there are no permanent solutions planned to protect the area from who visit. My question to the minister is, will the minister please tell this House when he expects a permanent plan to be in place that will address the concerns of residents and protect the ecosystem that's at risk?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is a balanced approach that the department takes with any beach or designated area. There is expectations that the community does have access, but we have to understand that there are impacts from human activity in the area. We have supported retaining a summer student for the community to expand community outreach to ensure that the educational components are out there so that people understand what impacts do take place, but that beach will remain as protected under the Beaches Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. This government has been promoting the push towards more collaborative care clinics and the recruitment of nurse practitioners to make up for the shortage in family doctors, a shortage that the government refuses to admit. However, my office has been receiving calls from people who were desperate for primary health care, so they took appointments with nurse practitioners, only to find out the nurse practitioners aren't permitted to sign the necessary forms. This action, Mr. Speaker, resulted in those patients' removal from the 811 list. They did not receive the service they required, and now they're back at the bottom of the list. My question is this. If the government is encouraging people to go with nurse practitioners instead of a family doctor, why isn't legislation being updated to qualify nurse practitioners to sign the necessary forms?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we note, we continue to work across the province to expand access to primary care services. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that these services are best on a go-forward basis through collaborative teams working together, Mr. Speaker. That includes healthcare practitioners like family practice nurses, nurse practitioners, as well as physicians and other frontline healthcare providers, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the scope of practice that the member would be referring to, without specific details as to the nature of the content of the forms he's referring to, it would be difficult for me to make any kind of commitments in that regard.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Minister and I could chat about that case. Mr. Speaker, I, along with the residents of Dartmouth, we were delighted to see the announcement that Dartmouth would be receiving 4 new nurse practitioners. With 40% of the family doctors in Dartmouth retiring within the next 5 years, it was reassuring to see this investment. However, during budget estimates, when I asked the minister where these nurse practitioners would be practicing and how many patients they would be taking, he didn't provide an answer. So I ask again, where will the new nurse practitioners that have been allocated for Dartmouth be practicing, and how many patients will each be taking? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe the estimates are somewhere in the vicinity for a nurse practitioner as they build their practice somewhere in the 800 patients range that would be expected on a nurse practitioner basis. Whether that would be different for the sites in Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker, I believe in estimates we talked about this, and I'd indicate I'd be getting back to the member with that information. We're collecting all of the information for those commitments that I made during estimates debate, and we'll be getting back to the respective caucuses with that information collectively.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Communities, Cultures and Heritage. Last week I tabled guidelines for the Community Accessibility Program. This program singles out churches as the only not-for-profit organization that is blocked from applying for funding to make their facilities more accessible. On page 2 of the guidelines, it clearly states, ineligible facilities include federal and provincial government-owned buildings, private homes and buildings, church sanctuaries, and for-profit entertainment facilities. And I'll table those guidelines. The Minister has, my question for the Minister, Mr. Speaker, the Minister said this is different from the federal attestation policy. Could the Minister explain how disqualifying churches is in fact different?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to convey to the honourable member that we have 3 programs at Communities, Culture and Heritage that support accessibility to churches, and these programs are all open now and available for application.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Last week in a letter to me, the Minister said that he had funded 8 churches under the accessibility program, and I'll table that letter. In this letter, the Minister has also suggested churches could receive funds from the Community Facilities and Improvement Program, and I'll table. Under that program's guidelines, the following applicants and projects are not eligible: private sector organizations, individuals, municipalities, hospital or health facilities, education institutions, religious or faith sanctuaries, plus several other exclusions. The Minister seems to be admitting he's granting funds against his own rules. The rules should be changed, but right now it clearly states churches cannot receive funds. So my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is this. If the Minister is already choosing to ignore his own rules, will he change the rules next year so all churches and houses of worship are able to apply, or is he going to continue to make up the rules as he goes along?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe within each of the 3 programs that I mentioned, the criteria and the guidelines are very clear. And what I would do is encourage the member opposite to go down to one of the local churches in his community, go to Gibson Woods, and see how the program applies to a church.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. It's become very clear that this government has not gone far enough when consulting our First Nations people about the environmental impacts of Northern Pulp's new effluent pipe and proposal. So Pictou Landing First Nation is going to court. They say that while some consultation has occurred, it has not been broad enough to satisfy the community and does not fulfill the province's duty to consult. So given this government's stated commitment to truth and reconciliation, my question for the Premier is this. Why does Pictou Landing First Nations need to take court action to demand adequate consultation?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Chief Andrew and all the members of Pictou Landing who've worked so hard with our government to deal with an issue that has been ignored for far too long, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, that effluent is next to Mr. Speaker, to that community because it's an Aboriginal community, Mr. Speaker. No other place would have been allowed to site unless it was an African Nova Scotia community. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that the men and women on this side of the House stood with me to make sure that we're going to deal with this issue to take head on. Fact of the matter is, any changes when it comes to the treatment effluent treatment for the mill, we have consulted not only with Pictou's First Landing, we've consulted with the community. We're going to continue on a broader consultation. She actually looks at the court ruling, or what's being brought into the court is actually related to the mill, which is an ongoing entity, Mr. Speaker, not related to the fact of what we're talking about in terms of the treatment plant.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if the Premier actually cares about environmental racism, he could actually pass our bill, or our Environmental Rights Bill. Mr. Speaker, this this is not the first time this government has been found wanting when it comes to adequately consulting with First Nations of Nova Scotia. The courts have already ruled that the Department of Environment's approval of the Alton gas storage project was procedurally unfair because the department failed in its responsibilities to Siboneygadig First Nation. The Premier is very fond of saying we're all treaty people. So I have to ask the Premier, if we are all treaty people, why wasn't Pictou Landing First Nation adequately consulted about Northern Pulp's new effluent proposal ahead of this?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my earlier question, actually they were, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is the issue before the court has nothing to do with the treatment centre. It has to do with the actual mill itself. But I want to assure the honourable member, we are all treaty people, Mr. Speaker, and unlike the NDP, I didn't wait to get into opposition again, Mr. Speaker, put a bill before the House. I acted on it when I had the privilege to do what I'm doing.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, when a loved one reaches the end of their life, we all want them to be treated with dignity, care, and compassion. Our dedicated healthcare professionals want that as well. Danny Latimer, a terminally ill Richmond County man, stayed on a stretcher for 2 days inside a busy emergency room at the Straight Richmond Hospital, where there are no protected beds for palliative care. I'm going to table both an article in the Cape Breton Post and a letter sent by Danny's wife, Linda, to the Premier regarding their experience. And I'd like to quote, "Here is my 66-year-old husband, God bless his soul, that we can no longer take care of him at home." And she goes on to say, "Don't just talk the talk, walk the talk, and deliver." My question is, does the Minister of Health believe it is acceptable or even possible for appropriate palliative care to be delivered on a stretcher in a busy emergency room?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, thank you. I want to thank the honourable member for raising this important question in the House. End-of-life care, Mr. Speaker, is an important aspect of delivering health care across our province. It is unacceptable at any time, Mr. Speaker, that someone at the end of their life is left in a stretcher in any of our hospitals across the province. In fact, we're working with communities to provide the myriad of options that families have asked for, whether it's hospice care. We know in some of our communities we're working with some of our, whether it's health foundations, the auxiliaries, to ensure that we have palliative care facilities in our communities. And we're also hearing from communities who want to care for their loved one at home. Mr. Speaker, we're trying to provide those options, but it's a question that was brought before the House. Mr. Speaker, that family had come to the point where it required the assistance of our system, Mr. Speaker, and it's unacceptable that anyone at the end of their life is in on a stretcher in a hallway in our hospitals.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to hear that the Honourable Premier thinks that it's actually unacceptable to end their life on a stretcher, and perhaps we then can get something done about this situation. The stress and anguish of living with a terminal illness is devastating to families. It is unimaginable that some Nova Scotians must spend their last hours on a stretcher, as has happened on the Easter weekend, amid the chaos of an emergency room. That is not the palliative care that Nova Scotians deserve or expect from this government, and it's not the palliative care that constituents in Cape Breton-Richmond deserve, Mr. Speaker. Will the Honourable Premier apologize to Danny Latimer and his wife Linda for the ordeal they suffered last weekend and commit to providing dedicated palliative care beds and needed resources to the Straight Richmond Hospital?
The Honourable Premier.
Sure, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, Mr. It's unacceptable for any Nova Scotian to spend the end of their life, Mr. Speaker, in a hallway in a stretcher. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, we've had a very fractured healthcare system where palliative care was one of those, Mr. Speaker, that is very different depending on where you are in our province. It was looked at very differently. We believe that in a holistic way of looking at our healthcare system across the province, we're going to continue to work with our partners, Mr. Speaker, to make sure, Mr. Speaker, those that are looking for end-of-life care get a number of options to provide, which is the best way for them and their loved ones, Mr. Speaker, to be able to deal with the end-of-life situation they have. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that when they come into our healthcare system, they're treated with the dignity they deserve.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education has mentioned numerous times the importance of specialists in our school system and is committed to hiring them. It has become quite evident that schools have seen an increase of students with social and emotional issues. That is why having high-quality school psychologists and social workers is so important in today's schools. These specialists act as a bridge between the school and a difficult home life. Question to the Minister. Will the Minister inform this House on how many psychologists and social workers his department is prepared to hire for the upcoming 2018-19 school year so that no child is left behind to deal with these issues on their own?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's question. In last year's budget, we did provide funding for the hiring of 20 new school psychologists or speech language pathologists in the system, Mr. Speaker. We also, in this year's budget, are investing $15 million to implement the recommendations of the Inclusive Education Report, which will involve some of these special supports. We did also engage the Mount St. Vincent to bring in additional outside support to deal with the backlog of student psych assessments that we had. That is a practice we would like to continue, although I would inform the member that that has been grieved, and that decision is in arbitration right now, and the decision of that arbitrator will impact our ability to engage in that practice in the future. But we have believed that has been very helpful because we processed about 291 cases in that specific regard. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately today many students do not have the coping mechanisms needed to survive a problem, let alone a crisis. School psychologists and social workers are vital to the development of many of our in-need students. Many students enter our schools at a disadvantage due to their home environment or social emotional issues. School psychologists act as advocates for students, providing compassion and guidance to ensure that students' emotional issues are addressed appropriately and promptly. Question to the Minister. Will the Minister inform this House with regard to his department's criteria for placing these necessary specialists within our school system?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We do rely heavily on the decisions of those frontline workers in our regional centres to inform us in terms of how those resources are allocated. I'll also inform the member that we have extended our Schools Plus program. We are now close to 80% coverage for students in this province, and that is linking our students to supports outside of the education system in health, justice, community services that are relevant to the particular case that they're dealing with. And I do believe moving forward, in order to implement the recommendations of the inclusion report, we do need to look again to more outside supports outside of the education system. But again, when we've done that, that has been agreed by the union. We do need their support to engage in that activity moving forward because we have a lot of work to do to ensure students are getting the supports that they need.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, the Minister of Justice has said in response to this government's response to the legalization of marijuana that the plan is for the health and safety of Nova Scotians, especially children and youth. But the Association of Psychologists of Nova Scotia says that there is evidence that cannabis can harm developing brains up to the age of 25, and it may cause psychosis in predisposed individuals, and I will table that information. Has the Minister found a supplier of some kind of magical marijuana that will not cause psychosis in the 1 in 25 young people who will use it when it is legalized by the federal government and normalized by this government?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague for the question. I know this becomes a repetitive response, but Mr. Speaker, the matter of facts are quite clear and quite simple for people to understand. We presently have an illegal, illicit market where the quality and the content of that product is unknown, Mr. Speaker. It contributes to the mental health issues that my colleague has identified. That's not going away, Mr. Speaker. The attempts of our legislation and our bill is to provide a framework of regulation for a legal product, Mr. Speaker, that enhances public safety. Now, I know that's hard for some people to understand, but Mr. Speaker, it's as simple as this. We continue with the illicit market, or we implement measures, Mr. Speaker, that provides some quality control to a product that we're not encouraging use of, Mr. Speaker. We're simply identifying a safer, more reasonable way to enhance public safety.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Doesn't that sound nice, Mr. Speaker? Doesn't that sound nice? There's a reason why it was illegal. And I don't understand why the government continues to say that they're doing this for the health and safety, especially of young Nova Scotians. It doesn't matter, Mr. Speaker, if you buy your marijuana from an illegal dealer or soon from the NSLC. It doesn't, and I'll tell you why. And the Nova Scotia Psychologists Association will tell you why as well, if this government will listen to them. Mr. Speaker,
There is no such thing as healthy and safe marijuana for those people that the Nova Scotia Association of Psychologists has identified. Mr. Speaker, that is a fact. Why does the government lead young Nova Scotians to believe otherwise?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know my colleague is persistent on this particular point, but Mr. Speaker, we as a government are not going to abdicate our responsibilities to provide a safe environment. Mr. Speaker, the illegal market and the consumption of the illegal product is having devastating effects on our youth. We know that, Mr. Speaker. I agree with my colleague. But, Mr. Speaker, that is not going away by government, regardless of who's in power, turning their eyes and mind away from that. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, we have to put a framework in place that enhances public safety, educates the public on the consumption of these products, Mr. Speaker, and consistent with efforts of the smoking cessation strategy, Mr. Speaker, at a point going forward, reducing the consumption of illegal.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 56 first responders died by suicide last year across Canada, and I know that the federal government has stepped up to the plate to ensure that those services that they provide or are responsible for, that their members get access to services. I know the government has made a commitment to expand the benefits of WCB, and those who have been diagnosed with PTSD, like firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, can hopefully gain access to those benefits, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education could indicate when those first responders here in Nova Scotia will see the changes needed.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we all agree in this House, as we saw with unanimous supporting of that bill, that our first responders are integral to our society, and we all have a great thanks for them. I can advise the member that upon the passing of that bill, it was a 1-year period before all of the benefits would be in place for our first responders, and that would be sometime this coming fall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but with all respect, I think we could move a little quicker on this file. We have first responders who I speak to on a regular basis who are currently being denied benefits, Mr. Speaker. They don't have the luxury to have been maybe a police officer with the RCMP and gaining access to programs, Mr. Speaker. They're being denied benefits. They're being denied support in the province. And so I'd like to ask the Minister if that timeline could be sped up so that those men and women who are in a dark place today, Mr. Speaker, will have the support of benefits through WCB.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd be more than happy to work with the member with those cases, have conversations with WCB. They know our intent, Mr. Speaker, and from having conversations with them even before consultation was done, because consultation over the 1-year period wasn't to have a year not to provide benefits. What it was to have a year to actually look at perhaps expanding who we're going to provide benefits to. So I'm more than happy to get a copy of those cases with the member, take them to WCB, and have a further look into them, because in my opinion, as is the members, those individuals should have the supports that they deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Argyle-Barrington for giving me his spot. I'm going to fly free here on this one since we have a bit of extra time. It's unacceptable in the way that palliative care is being treated in Cape Breton-Richmond and across this province, Mr. Speaker. It's unacceptable that people have to live the last days of their life in retrofitted storage closets and having to live the last days of their lives on stretchers in emergency rooms. And in this particular case of Mr. Latimer being forced to go back home basically and having his wife having to take care of him at the end of his life. I would like to ask the Honourable Premier yet again, or the Minister of Health, if they will commit to providing dedicated palliative care beds and resources to the Strait Richmond Hospital, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question again. I want to tell her, Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable that the story that's been brought through the paper and she brings to the floor of this House when it comes to end-of-life treatment. We want to make sure that we have a number of options for Nova Scotians, whether it is hospice, whether it's palliative care in a hospital, whether it's supporting families at home. And I want to assure the Honourable Member that the Minister of Health and the Department of Health and Nova Scotia Health Authority will work with all of our facilities to ensure that we have the appropriate services in communities across our province.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Being in a very vulnerable position to begin with and being so unwell, and in Mr. Latimer's case, and I don't think that they would mind because they've given me permission to speak on this, who has metastatic renal cancer and it's throughout his body, it's extraordinarily painful and extraordinarily difficult to watch a person go through the last stages of their lives, as many of us would have had that experience. They do not, he and his wife Linda do not want the last days of his life to be at home in Petit de Gras in Cape Breton-Richmond, Mr. Speaker. What is the Premier prepared to do in order to be able to assist this family in order to give them a guaranteed palliative care bed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move